Hello everyone, welcome to another NetHope Solution Center webinar. Today we'll be talking about creating a thriving digital culture for nonprofits. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. The last part was regarding virtual culture and leadership, and today we're talking about virtual workshops. Again, thanks for joining. My name is Madeline No, and I'm with NetHope. And today our presenting organizations are Accenture, Amref Health Africa, and PATH. Before we get started, one more back, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session. Let's try to keep this session interactive. Please post any of your questions or comments in the chat window for our Q&A session toward the end of the hour today. Later on today or early tomorrow, please look for a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording for this session and any collateral or links to further information that will be posted on the NetHope Solution Center. And at the end of the hour, we really appreciate your feedback. You'll see a webinar satisfaction poll pop up after you close the session, and we would very much appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to complete that poll. Your feedback is very important. And with that, I will introduce our speakers for today. Joining us, we have Alice Campbell, Fjord Design and Innovation Director with Accenture, Joseph Kayaya, Lead Product Manager with PATH, Bhavya Gowda, Deputy Director, Living Labs with PATH, Isaac Nitiga, Senior Technical Advisor with Amref Health Africa, and Ratika Jain, Accenture Development Partnerships Consultant with Accenture. And with that, I will hand it off to Ratika to kick off our presentation.
Great. Thank you, Madeline, and welcome everyone to this 2-part series that Madeline gave such a great introduction to. Our first session on June 25th was around building a vibrant virtual culture and effective leaders for a remote workforce. We had Fingo and Trigger Eyes speak about their experiences as it relates to these 2 topics. Today, as Madeline mentioned, we'll be focusing on facilitating engaging and impactful virtual workshops. We'll share some best practices broadly, talking about some of the theory, and then we'll focus in on specific experiences that PATH and Amref will bring to life. So what's on our agenda? We'll start by doing a quick icebreaker. We'll be using a tool called Mentimeter to poll the audience for this activity. Then we'll share some best practices. Alice and I will talk through some best practices around impactful virtual workshops, and then we'll spend the majority of the time hearing from PATH and Amref, and we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if everyone could just take their mobile phones or open a new internet browser on their laptops, start by going to www.menti.com and using this code 893562. I will hand it off to Alice to take us through a couple initial questions to gather your feedback.
Hi everyone, it's really great to be here. So the question that we want to ask all of you is, in one word, if you could describe what you found to be the most difficult part of transitioning to virtual work. It's a really interesting time to live in. This is probably one of the biggest kind of historical moments that has affected the world in terms of how we work, how we collaborate, and we're really interested to hear back from you. And I can see already some responses popping up, which is great. I'll give it another 10 seconds, but I can already see balance, facilitation being a difficult thing, which we'll talk about today, leadership, habits. It's exhausting, I do agree, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that. Concentration can be hard, especially when in front of a screen most of the day. Family life as well, we'll talk a little bit about that as well as it relates to facilitation and just creating a safe environment. Distractions at home as well, yep. Excellent, well, thank you for providing some responses. This is a great way to just get a pulse on how we're all feeling, just recognizing that the times that we live in. So what we would like to do next, as Ritika moves on to the next slide. Oh, actually, sorry, let's have a look at this question as well. So how do you feel about facilitating virtual meetings, which will be what we talk about in the next 15 minutes. Let's see how people feel about some of these statements here. Interesting. Tools seem to be a big area which we'll cover for a bit as well. Technology challenges. Yep, Ritika will actually be addressing this at the end of our presentation. And I think a lot of some of these challenges pointed out here will be actually covered hopefully during the presentation. I'd love to hear from you guys later in Q&A if we haven't covered anything. But let's get started, and hopefully we'll answer most of these questions, including structure, engagement, and making everyone heard. So if we can move on, Ritika, we'll actually talk about some of the tips and tricks that we've been able to gather along the way. As Accenture, for a while now, we've been working remotely. Not everything that we do was remote. We definitely had a lot of in-person sessions, whether it's workshops, doing research. So we have had to transition ourselves as well to fully remote, but learned quite a few things along the way. And I wanted to touch on some of these principles. And again, as Madeline mentioned, you will be receiving this deck, so we won't go through each point because I think our panelists who will talk about some of their case studies will probably have more to say to add color to these. But one of those principles being more time, bigger team. So transitioning to remote workshops isn't the same as being in the room. If you were able to maybe facilitate as one person before, you're going to be at least 2 people. So planning for a bigger team, just to make sure that you can have that orchestra right is really important. And then you can go back to basics. So those things you do with a whiteboard in the room, those things that you do where you break out into teams, you can do all of that thanks to the tools that we do have, but it's just important to plan ahead of time for all of these things. It's really important to be human. And what do we mean by that? Well, to basically consider that no one really likes to sit in front of a screen for more than 3-4 hours, and it does become hard to stay engaged. So what are some things that you could do to stay human? And we'll talk about those tips and tricks. Less is definitely more. Maybe plan for 1/3 of what you would normally do in a room when planning for a workshop, and really try and be outcome oriented. What are some nice to haves versus some must haves that should really drive how you structure your agenda and use that time? So some roles that we've noticed are critical, and there's probably more out there, is obviously your facilitators and making sure that you have someone always in what we'd call the plenary or the main stage versus in your breakout rooms. Making sure that you have someone who's keeping a pulse on the energy, maybe floating into the breakout rooms to see if everyone's good, clear, and on time. Having an IT person to rely on, because things can go wrong, as we know, and that's okay, right? But to have that person for troubleshooting is extremely important. And in any meeting, not just workshops, just having your note taker who can actually help visualize for the larger group what is being discussed. So here are some tools illustratively, and there's many more out there, but these are some of the ones that we really have been enjoying as we think about how we plan workshops. And there's 3 big categories. One being, you definitely need a video conferencing tool, right? We want to stay human, we want to see each other. And even if you can't see each other, just to make sure that you have the chat tools and the audio tools to be able to communicate efficiently during a workshop. Whiteboarding as well has been super important for us. We are visual thinkers. Even if we're not necessarily sketching anything or creating anything, it's really helpful and actually more inclusive to have post-its like in Mural, where you can actually document things on the fly. And there's definitely other tools like Miro and Microsoft Whiteboard that also do this. And being able to poll within the group, this really actually adds a nice rhythm so that you're making sure that you're not always presenting or talking at a crowd, but also able to get a 2-way communication going. So some other principles, and we've broken it out into preparing for the session, during the session, and after the session. When we think about preparing for the session, this is really where you want to invest most of your time, because if you can actually get this right, a lot of things will go really smooth. Optimizing the agenda is really important. And what do we mean by this? Really time boxing all of your activities, but also thinking about what's necessary and who's necessary at what time. Maybe not everyone needs to be part of the agenda at all times, and you could give certain groups a break. Or maybe there are things that could happen offline, right? I really particularly enjoy doing sessions where I give breakout teams some time of their own to think through the problem offline and then come back to another session and breaking it across the week. Focus on the experience. As I mentioned, there's Mural and other great tools that help you make it visual so that everyone's able to follow. Testing technology is critical. We can't test enough. We do excessive amounts of dry runs to make sure tech and everything is in place. And over preparing is also part of that. Making sure that you almost have a B plan for things going wrong, because that does happen quite a bit. So in that case, what do you do? One thing that you can do is definitely sending pre-reads ahead of time, sending all the materials and putting it into one place, and sharing the agenda and all the links to maybe the mural boards ahead of time. And I'll pass it on to Ritika to just give a flavor of what an agenda could look like.
Thanks, Alice. So how to take that in-person agenda that you might have previously used for before this COVID-19 period and put it into virtual. A couple things to keep in mind. Activities take longer, so definitely plan more time, especially for parts of the agenda where you're doing a collaborative activity or discussion-based. More breaks are required to keep energy levels high and screen fatigue low. And keep some contingency time at the end of the session. We've previously used, up to 30 minutes in contingency time to make up for activities running long, to make up for slow starts, or technical difficulties, which are much more common when thinking about remote sessions and virtual meetings and workshops. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of how to take something that you would normally do in person and convert to a virtual workshop.
Great, and here let's take a look at some examples. So we had a bunch of principles, but what does this look like? So here you're seeing an example, for instance, of an agenda where we did a 2-day co-creation workshop. You can already see some of the principles applied. We haven't designed for more than 3 to 4 hours a day. But more importantly, this color coding key that you're seeing on the top right is actually to do with the audiences that we rotated in and out. So not everyone actually had to be part of the 4 hours even. So really think about how you can actually make the most of people's time and the different skill sets and points of view that they're bringing in for different parts of the agenda. We talked about making things memorable and keeping things visual. Mural is one of our favorite tools. We started doing way too much in Mural, including even project planning, maybe even creating stories and presentations in Mural, because it is so versatile. So I can't stress enough how well this works for any kind of a workshop. And on the right, you can see an extreme version of co-creation, where we even have co-creation workshops where we can design products and solutions together using Mural. So during this session, what are some things that you want to do? Building trust and creating a safe space is extremely important. In the beginning of the session, we saw that it was hard to stay focused and avoid the distractions at home. This is true for everyone. So how about we make it a safe space? So if you have kids crawling all over you on the call, I think we've all learned a different level of empathy during these times, and making that okay is actually really important. Being clear on expectations and guidelines is also really important. You'll notice that in Mural, I actually love putting in very specific structures and almost designing an experience for how people should be navigating some of those activities we're asking them to do. Energizers are really important. Don't be shy to bake in a ton of breaks, because it really does help get the blood flowing and a different kind of energy level that can be brought rather than sitting in a chair for 4 hours. And you could do that together, or you could give your audience time to do that. And obviously limit one-way communication, because the point is to have a workshop. And get comfortable radio silence. I'm going super quick right now because we have a lot to say, but having some breaks and pauses is actually not a bad thing. So it is actually a good thing to kind of get comfortable with radio silence at times, to give people a moment to think. So here's an example of structure. You could create little storyboards like you're seeing on the left, or you could have more involved activities like on the right, where you have more of a grid structure to post some responses. And you can see little videos of how that can look in Mural. But at the least, even if you have the simplest activity, just make sure to put all of your instructions into the collaboration space rather than on PowerPoint, so you're keeping everyone focused in the same place. And taking breaks is really important. Again, you can do this together, or you can give people a moment to stretch, but this is an example of a slide that we bake in when we do workshops. And we usually kind of put in a break at least every hour, so that people can have a bio break, grab a cup of tea, and stretch if they need to. And then talking about Mainstage and juggling that with breakout groups, it's actually not that difficult. Now, this is just an example from MS Teams, Microsoft Teams. You could do it in Zoom as well, but it's really important to kind of keep the communication channels going. So it's easier, obviously, when everyone's in the same place during Mainstage or plenary time, like we are right now. But once you go into breakout groups, you want to have those sub channels where you can actually bring people back, whether that's on the actual chat or whether you have a WhatsApp chat going, which Ritika will talk about in a bit. And then after the session, these are maybe some obvious things, but good to remember nonetheless. Always asking for feedback on how we can improve. Providing enough time for synthesis to digest what was said on day one, to be able to then prepare accordingly for day two, and sending out the materials as well. And usually this is why virtual is actually so good, because everything's documented in Mural once you've completed the session. So you don't need to take photos of things or send them out separately usually. Great, and I want to hand over to Ritika, who has quite a bit of experience dealing with low connectivity settings.
Thanks, Alice. And thanks. As Alice went through all of those tips kind of to design the session, before the session, during and after, we know that one of the biggest challenges for many of the people on this call, and for Path and Amref and in the workshops that we did together with them, was around bandwidth, bringing participants together from diverse time zones, and really how to make this successful in the settings that you all are in. So here are just a couple of tips that we've put together specifically when you're preparing for workshops where people are dialing in from low connectivity settings or may have bandwidth challenges. Firstly, simple instructions and activities are crucial. So if people get disconnected, they're able to jump back in without feeling lost or confused. So definitely oversimplify as much as possible. Have multiple options to fall back on if you face technical challenges. Having an offline copy of the research or instructions for an activity ready to send via PDF. And being prepared to move onto another platform, another technology platform if needed, such as Skype or WhatsApp. And we've actually had to move a couple of things over to WhatsApp in different workshop examples, which Amref actually in particular will be talking about in a few minutes. Use what participants are most comfortable with. Almost everyone has a mobile phone. If you can cover their airtime so they can use hotspot if needed, or use their mobile apps for audio or collaboration when their computer's internet is down, that will really help you avoid any crucial disruptions to the flow of your activities. Make sure you have someone on your team whose primary role is a tech super user. And Alice talked about this, but this role is especially important when you have participants with bandwidth challenges. This person can be the main point of contact to support with technical difficulties, getting people back into the meeting, or just moving the entire thing to your plan B option. It's okay not to use video if bandwidth is a challenge, to focus on really getting the essential audio in. And then finally, really focus on that preparation before the workshop to test the ability of people to use the technology and tools. We often schedule sort of a 30 to 40-minute preparation session ahead of bigger workshops. We talk about sort of the essential functionalities of the tool during that time and get people to really test their comfort level. And this helps to make the session a success and minimize difficulties on day one. Great, so thanks for letting us sort of run through some of the theory behind this. I know you guys are probably most interested in really what Path and Amref have to talk about. So I'll pass it on to them to really bring some of this to life and talk about how they made that transition from in-person to successful virtual meetings and workshops in this COVID situation.
Great. Thanks so much, Ritika. Hi, everyone. My name is Afya, and I'm going to chat a little bit about our workshop that we had with the ADP team a couple of months ago. But maybe just before we dive in, not sure about the makeup of the audience, but PATH is a global team of innovators working to eliminate health inequities so people, communities, and economies can thrive. We're a global organization of about 1,500 individuals, and our staff includes scientists, health professionals, business leaders, engineers, advocates, and dozens of other specialties. Living Labs is an initiative within PATH, and we're focused on accelerating the pace of health innovation by co-creating with users to rapidly design, test, and scale solutions to their long-standing challenges. A big focus of our initiative is to sustainably build human-centered design capacity in our country offices. And that's what you can see that was the focus of our workshop that we had with the ADP team. So our workshop was scheduled to happen in April. And as probably everybody on this call knows, things really started heating up with COVID, especially in the US in early to mid-March. So we had to pivot rather quickly from an in-person workshop to a virtual format. And so while it would have been really nice to do this in person, there were actually a lot of silver linings and benefits from going virtual. We're able to engage more participants, especially individuals from a broader array of PATH country offices that we probably wouldn't have been able to do so had we kept with the in-person format. And we were also able to engage PATH leadership at different points over the course of the workshop. Since we had people from across the world, time zones got really tricky. This is something that Alice and Ritika just mentioned. Our colleagues in Seattle were up super early in the morning. They started at 6 a.m. Pacific time. And we also tried to ensure that our colleagues in the India office were off their computers and off their screens by 10 or 10:30 India time. So clearly working across a lot of different time zones made it challenging, but we were also really targeted about who we engaged and when. We also shortened the overall session and stretched it out over the course of 2 weeks as opposed to cramming everything into 3 days, which is what we would have done had we been in person. And as Alice and Ritika mentioned, we were also really conscious about making sure we were engaging across multiple platforms. So in particular for our session, we leveraged Mural and Zoom, and we also fell back onto PowerPoint. Sometimes Mural was a little glitchy, and with so many people online, it was taking a really long time to like drag Post-it notes. And so we also had a fallback on PowerPoint as well. The other thing to note, which I think Alice mentioned earlier, was it does take a lot of time to prepare. And so there was a lot of work that both PATH and the ADP teams put in advance in order to ensure that we could pivot over to a remote platform. Next slide, please. So we've broken this up into a couple of different reflections, and the first three I'm going to cover, and then we'll pass it off to my colleague Joseph. But it was really important that we scheduled a 45-minute prep session. This ensured that all of the participants could get comfortable with Mural as a program. Although not everybody was able to join, it was really helpful to have a practice run so individuals could get familiar with some of the different functionalities before we actually got started. And it was also a nice way to just break the ice and allow different members of the PATH team to get to know individuals at ADP and Fjord and vice versa. So it made it a much more comfortable environment once we actually started the workshop. As I mentioned previously, this format allowed us to widen the number of participants that we were able to engage. Given different time zones and schedules, we were also very explicit and selective about who we were asking to join at what points of the workshop, and to ensure that we were able to gather their feedback really strategically. And by widening the number of both country office representatives as in addition to leadership participants, I felt this really led to a much richer discussion compared to whether we had done this in person in Nairobi. And one key follow-up from this is the director of Living Labs and I are actually in the process this week of having a lot of follow-up conversations with each of the country representatives that participated in the workshop to ensure that we're having an ongoing dialogue with them about how we can achieve our goal of building a sustainable HCD model within PATH. And being able to engage with them now is really a follow-up because we were able to engage with them early on in the process. And that was so critical to ensuring that we're able to build this body of work. Joseph, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Bhavya. And so in addition to what Bhavya has said, one of the things that was really great about this workshop was the fact that even though it was a virtual workshop, we're in different locations, 8 different time zones. One of the things was that it was really fun. And one of the things that we ensured that was taking place was having the icebreakers that were referred to. As you can see in the screenshot on the slide deck, this is one of those icebreakers that we did where everybody was requested to select something from their purse that they loved the most, and they had to explain why they loved it the most. Something unusual, something that you would take for granted, but it was one of those opportunities to really just get interacting and have the human experience, even though it was a virtual collaboration. In addition to that, considering the fact that we are mostly working from home, there is aspects of having a family around you as you're attending these workshops. And so being flexible and being able to meet some of the family members for some of the participants was really great, because then that also helps us to still really connect with the human aspect of our work, even though we're working virtually and collaborating with online tools. And then one of the great aspects of this training also was the fact that even though we were having scheduled times to collaborate and to meet for the sessions, we had opportunities to have homework. And so this allowed people outside of the workshop time, outside of the scheduled time, to be able to reflect and be able to gather additional perspectives, as well as be able to ensure that we are adding richness and depth to the conversations when we meet in those targeted sessions, which added a lot of value to the process. And then, as has been alluded to by Bhavya and Ritika earlier, sometimes Muro would get slow because of the numbers of people, but also there would be issues of connectivity associated with that, depending on the location. It was always great to have a backup plan, and that's something that we've actually learned and picked up going forward in most of the meetings that would host with other stakeholders within our Living Labs project, to just ensure that we've got a backup plan so that in case the actual tool that we are using, in this case Muro, is not working efficiently, the PowerPoint that has been prepared prior becomes a better opportunity to be able to move the process forward. Next slide. And so some of the key outputs that we got from this workshop was we were able to collaborate across the different geographies to be able to come up with 3 design directions for the future, that we're looking at how we can have sustainable models for Living Labs and HCD work within PATH, and be able to have that value within the space where we operate as an organization. But also there was an opportunity within this collaboration to have both internal and external buy-in, to be able to drive that demand internally within PATH, but also to be able to drive that demand with external stakeholders, so that we can be able to move this process forward efficiently. And then it was very, very good that at the end of the sessions, we were able to get to a point of alignment in terms of the direction that we were taking, the concepts and the innovations that people had come up with through the collaboration virtually, to be able to have specific next steps. And some of those next steps are the aspects that Bhavya was referring to with the follow-up conversations with the country representatives, but also looking at how we can be able to bridge the gap between the local country offices and the PATH global offices around human-centered design work. And then one of the great opportunities that we had within this workshop was the lessons and the experiences that we gathered from the virtual workshop environment, which was, for me personally, one of the first experiences that I had just after joining PATH to be a part of this process and being exposed to great tools like Muro and being able to see the opportunity for virtual collaboration and how you're still able to meet your targets and be able to do the great work over different time zones, over different timestamps and different expertise was a great experience and a great learning experience for the rest of the team. And that's something that we carry forward going forward as a Living Labs team. Thank you.
Great. Well, then I will pass on to Isaac to touch on the Amref Workshops.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. And my name is Isaac Trigger from Amref Africa. I'm happy to be here with all of you attending this webinar. And maybe to introduce Amref Africa. Amref Africa is an African international organization founded in 1957. And we began as the Flying Doctors of East Africa, but later grew into a health non-government organization working in 35 countries in Africa, reaching more than 10 million people per year through various health programs. Our vision is to have a lasting health change in Africa. And our mission is to increase sustainable health access to communities in Africa through solutions, in human resources for health services delivery, and other investments in health. Now, coming to our experience during this era of going virtual, we had 2 workshops, and this has grown to many more workshops moving forward, but in partnership with Accenture. We had our Afya Timiza workshop. Afya Timiza is one of the projects in Amref where we focus on increasing access to quality maternal child health and reproductive health services to communities in hard to reach areas of northern Kenya, basically Turkana and Samburu counties. And the focus of our workshop for this Afya Timiza team was to co-create solutions to address COVID-related disruptions to last mile program delivery. We were already working in a hard to reach area, and then COVID came in, and we still had to ensure that the mothers, the children in very difficult to reach areas still had access to health. We had to sit and plan. We had to ensure that we knew how to get services to them. We had to make sure that even though people were working from home, there were curfews, there were lockdowns, in the country. We had to still ensure that plans went on and the health workers on the front line received support. And we had a team of 9 participants working from various locations, some in Nairobi, others deep in the field. And we were able to use tools like Teams and Muro to really go through this. And eventually we were able to design, and come up with a very easy to implement plan, whereas people were contributing from the houses, some from the field, depending on where COVID-19 response measures found us. The Innovate for Life workshop is a workshop. Innovate for Life is a program within Amref where we look at linking young innovators with health solutions to the market, to the outside world, so that they're able to further develop their innovations, their tech innovations, and be able to put them into the market for use and grow them to scale. And our focus was to have a partnership development forum between Amref and health innovators in Kenya and Ethiopia. This had 20 participants. We used Zoom, we used Muro, and we used the PowerPoint presentation also as a part of what we used. And eventually we were able to come up with the products, and I think we can go to the next slide. Now, from these 2 workshops, reflections from the first workshop through the Afya Timiza project, one of the things that we discovered is that there's a lot of pre-work, a lot of homework, a lot of individual work that had to be done for us to be able to have a successful virtual meeting, a virtual workshop. Yes, we were able to develop this very nice service blueprint with priorities, with the steps all the way. But then one of the things that we learned along the way is that to allow participants to work together, to allow the workshop to be productive and effective, there is a lot of pre-work that are to be done individually and even probably in other virtual groups for us to be able to develop this and have a service blueprint that enabled us to come up with a way of building the capacity of the people out in the field that would be able to reach, the last mile persons with health services. Technical difficulties. As I said, Afya Timiza works in an already challenged area. Poor road network, poor electricity, poor network coverage, and challenges evolved moving into breakout rooms. Sometimes you could not move, losing voices, and activities took much longer, due to those technical disruptions. You wanted the activity to be completed by a team and in a participatory environment and not by individuals. So you realize that the movement, like you can see there, you realize when you look at the image there and you see the various breakout rooms by the contributors in the meeting, you realize there's a person who has several boxes already done, some are beginning, some have not even started at all. And this made it a little bit difficult to complete this in a short time. If it was in a normal workshop session in a room, we would probably do this in 2-3 days, but you realize that you have to do pre-work, then technical difficulties, and this would take much longer than the time that you would need. Next. On the Innovate for Life, reflections for us are around the clear structures that were put in place. Even before the workshop, the meeting took place, that we knew where each member would go to. We had the mural board as a tool that we used. It was divided in groups and simplified activity, not very many activities. You do like 3 activities, but an activity per session, timed. And this clear structure is what would enable and what enabled us and what would enable anyone to come out with a very clear deliverable when working virtually and using these technology platforms to hold workshops. Facilitators are key. For each of the breakout rooms, other than leaving people out there, we learned that having a breakout facilitator works wonders. This is a person who is able to know who is stuck, know who is who has dropped and need to be picked up through another way, knows what point has been raised, and is able to bring together the common ideas as well as ideas that require further discussion by the larger team. And what's up, as much as we were on Teams, and we realized that WhatsApp was also an interesting backup for us. Some entire conversations were moved into WhatsApp so that we were able to get necessary inputs from participants from various locations, so that everybody had to participate and provide their input through the process. So, as has been shared earlier, a backup is critical. Just one platform may not deliver for you, especially when you are in remote settings that have difficulties in coverage, especially network coverage, and other challenges. Next slide. So, from all this, we were able to learn how virtual ways can help us work in low bandwidth settings. Basically, have more than one platform with you. Have a facilitator. and make sure that you have ways to pick up people who drop out. We also are able to generate ideas to address COVID-related disruptions. Because now, as much as we used this to plan for the program, now we are taking this further to be able to use it, to provide key updates to health workers on the front line. We are using this to engage. We are using this to find out how people are continuing with their daily work and what support they are getting. But then we realize we have to have more than just a platform. We need more, and we need backups. Buy-in is a key output that I know if you're looking to partner, you need to agree. And these virtual platforms actually enabled us to meet, to agree, and partnership agreements were developed especially between innovators and Amref Health Africa without having any physical meeting. Meeting virtually, we have plans that move 3, 6, 9 months into the future. And of course, we are able to get aligned on a path forward for potential partnerships with the innovators, with our clients in the field, with the government. We have been able to forge real partnerships that we are going to move forward, for Afya Timiza project, for the Innovate for Life program, as well as other areas that we are learning through Amref. So, yeah. I think that is it from my end. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Madeline, should we then focus on Q&A? We have a good amount of time for Q&A.
This is Frederick. Yeah, I'll be more than happy to take the questions. The one question everybody are very, very curious about would be ideas around icebreakers. So I'll throw that out to all the panelists and ask about, what kind of icebreakers have you found to be particularly productive?
I don't mind going. Maybe I'll just throw some ideas out there, and if anyone wants to add on more. I think there's really no rules around icebreakers, and really, if we think about its role, it is to talk about something that's different than the agenda of the meeting or the purpose of the meeting, just so that you can start having a rapport with the audience and your fellow kind of participants. So if that is really the idea of an icebreaker, you can really come up with anything that is just a human conversation. Now, obviously you want to keep to time and not have something that runs over half an hour, but some of the things that we like that have served us well in terms of just really quick responses where you could go through 15, 20 people pretty quickly are things like, please write down your name on a sticky, on mural, or on Google Doc, and then also tell us something that no one else in the room knows about. You can actually go through them pretty quickly if the answer is short, and I think that's what's key to icebreakers. You can use that same model with write your name down, and please answer this following question with, what is a superpower that you're bringing to the session today and why? Or what is your spirit animal and why? So you can get really interesting answers to some of these questions and really get to know your fellow teammates at a completely different level. Sometimes you can even put your video on and actually have everyone talk about something that they find interesting about their setup. It could be introducing their kids, or it could be talking about an object that they have that they really have a sentimental attachment to. But again, the key is to keep it pretty brief so you can actually go through each participant in no longer than 10 to 15 seconds. I hope that helps, and if anyone has any other additions, please go ahead.
Anyone else on the panel that have suggestions of icebreakers? I went out on did just a Google search for icebreakers or virtual teams, virtual sessions, and there's thousands of results that came back. So please go ahead and do that, and I'm sure you'll find something that'll work really well.
Actually, a quick add-on. If you're running out of time, you could even use Menti as a way to do an icebreaker. I liked one that I saw recently, which was you know, since lockdown, what has been a favorite pastime, or what has been some shows or interesting things you've been watching? And if everyone actually inputs their answers into Menti, you're able to kind of scan the cloud, the word cloud, to see what some interesting answers are, where you don't need to go through each and every one. But if you wanted to call out any of them and people want to come forward, that could also be a shorter way of doing it.
Excellent. So let's go back to some of the questions. I'll just take them in the order that they came in. This first question was for you, Alice. You mentioned that one should potentially expect more attendees in a virtual session. Do you feel that there's a certain size of group where you rely more on chat and other keyboard tools versus making two-way audio available to all?
Yeah, I mean, since we are talking about workshops, I think it's key to think about a realistic size, because usually if you have too many participants, it's hard to get to a good depth of conversation and to actually have an organized conversation in the first place. Even assuming if you're going into breakout groups, there has to be plenary moments and share out moments. So usually when we plan for workshops, we try and plan for no more than 25 to 30 people. Now that doesn't mean that you can't actually have more people. It just might mean that you do multiple sessions. Maybe session A builds on session B, and you're actually using people's time in a different way, where everyone still gets to input, but not everyone is having, you know, the same discussion in the same session. So, you know, there's clever ways to kind of go about that. And also just in general, whether it's virtual or in person, just being really mindful of who really needs to attend, because I think in general, that's what makes a good workshop, at least in our opinion. And we actually even go to the extent of creating a spreadsheet where we put in a type of skill set or a point of view or background that we're looking for that's going to be valuable to the session, and making sure that we're not duplicating that, because obviously it's great to be inclusive and we want to have as many voices involved, but sometimes that can be that can backfire if there's too many, and then, you know, you risk not being able to get what you want from the session. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. Any other panelists that has thoughts on this? Well, let's move on to the next question. First, there was thanks for the webinar. I'm surprised that you say activities take longer. It felt like discussions were more straightforward and faster online, as people tend not to go into side conversation. This is more of a comment than a question, but I don't know if anyone have any thoughts on this. There was the related question that was, how do you make sure that people actually do pay attention? So I'll read the question. How do you manage to ensure people participated throughout, as in our meetings, you tend to have a couple who dominate every meeting and the rest stay silent. So maybe those two, one comment and one question, can be addressed here.
Yeah, this is Isaac. We also thought that going virtual would make things move faster. People don't have to travel. You don't have to book anybody anywhere. You don't have to, you know, organize a lot of logistics. But we realized that it takes longer. For example, where you have connectivity challenges, you want people to participate, they keep dropping out. So to deliver a point around the team, you're trying to find a backup. You're trying to get a person on WhatsApp to get their contribution. So you realize that to a point that you would have delivered in about 1-2 minutes, it takes you 10-15 minutes to go over that. And the other bit is that you also want to keep people participating. You see, when you're in a room, you're able to see everybody and you can see their mood, you can tell who is participating and who is not. But when you're working virtually, you have to keep calling on people. The role of the facilitator becomes key to make sure that they are able to look at who has contributed, either on the chat, either, you know, via voice, and you are able now to ensure that everybody comes on board. I think concentration is usually better because everybody wants to hear what the other person has to say. And the other way to keep people participating, for example, when you're on the mural, notes are being taken real time. The mirror board is there, you can move around it and be able to see what is happening. And because people are seeing others putting something on the mirror, then they are keen to have that participation in the meeting, and the facilitator is able to keep asking people of the challenges and everything. But yes, it takes longer than you would if you're just meeting face to face, or it would take longer than if you're just having a phone call one-on-one with a person. But remember, it's a big team, and everybody is in different places, very different challenges. That's my response for now.
While you were talking, there was a follow-on question about power dynamics and within these meetings, and how do you handle that among participants so that everyone participates without being overbearing or using the pecking order, intimidations and things like that. Isaac or anybody else?
This is Bhavya from PATH. I'm happy to chime in on this one. One thing that we were really intentional about is leveraging the breakout room functionality of Zoom. So I think that component of the virtual sessions was actually really helpful, because I think it's, for some individuals, it's easier to speak up when you're in a smaller group as opposed to on a larger call or meeting with 15, 20 plus people. And so I think that that's definitely an option and a functionality that can be leveraged in order to draw out different voices. And in terms of being able to handle potential power dynamics, when we were planning our workshop with ADP, we were also really intentional about how we split up the groups. So we split them up based on geography, based on level, on how long people had been at the organization. And so that was also really important in order to ensure that it wasn't just certain voices that were also always being heard. And so just being thoughtful and planning ahead on being intentional about how those groups are structured, I think could have a big payoff for a successful workshop. Over.
Excellent, thank you very much. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Ritika. I'm just going to add one other comment to what Bhavya said. Agree with all of that. Just that using some of the easy to use whiteboard activities and creating structure around that is an easy win and opportunity to create space for everyone to voice both their opinions and also document them on the whiteboard itself. So it creates sort of ownership in the actual output, as well as gives everyone an opportunity to contribute their ideas. So I would just add that in the breakout sessions, using those kinds of structured activities can help to achieve that as well.
And
Excellent.
The famous clock. We also had the clock, where you are able to use some of these tools like Teams to just set the clock to tick off. And when your minute or two is over, you're actually timed out. And it controls the length of the input and the contributions, and ensures that it goes around all the breakout rooms as well as around all the participants.
Excellent.
I might add that this goes back to the earlier point around just really spending time on the prep, which goes a long way. And think about the participants that are going to be joining, who have been purposefully invited. But I mean, another column that we kind of think about when we think about the different people that should be joining, to kind of avoid this kind of pecking order or dominant voices situation, is to actually think about the energy that we think they will be bringing. So within your organization, you probably know who are maybe the introverts and the extroverts, because that's also another layer to think about besides just dynamics. And just thinking about when you create the breakout group rosters, having a good balance of some of those introverts and extroverts, and making sure that you've set up the right chemistry in the teams will also go a long way.
Excellent, thank you. There were a couple of questions around multiple devices, screen sizes, and things like that. So the first question was, today we used Mentimeter for polls, and people may have used their phones for that in addition to following along on their larger computer screens. Do you have any tips, techniques, opportunities for participants using multiple devices? And then kind of a follow-on to that was, how do you manage the challenge of showing information on the screen, both quantity and the type size, and given the different screen tools people are using to participate?
I can go for a first stab at that. I mean, since we are talking about workshops, I think it's really important that whatever tools that we're using or content that we're using kind of scales across devices. Ideally, you've set expectations for everyone to be in front of a large enough screen, such as a laptop or a desktop computer. Not to say that, you know, phones won't work, but it can be challenging when actually using the collaboration spaces. Another best practice is to try and keep people focused on one device and channel. Now, even though as the facilitation group, your job is a bit harder and you might need to pay attention to WhatsApp to make sure things are rolling good. And, you know, you're also facilitating at the same time. You've got maybe content and slides that you're using. So it is a bit more hectic on the facilitation side. I think we can be real about that. But for your attendees, you want to make it a smooth experience and focused experience as much as possible. So if possible, you know, if you are in breakout groups, try and keep them all focused on one screen and one channel, meaning not a laptop and a phone at the same time, because that can be quite distracting to most of us. I think that's probably a good thing to remember. And obviously with Menti today, you know, some people use their phones, that's absolutely fine. But keep in mind that Menti is also available on the browser. So if someone was on their laptop, they could totally access it that way too.
Anybody else thoughts on multiple devices?
Hi, so this is Joseph coming in. So I think one of the things that I found very helpful in the workshop that we had was whenever we had a session where we all needed to look at a particular screen, I think on Miro, there's a functionality to summon everybody to follow you. So even though somebody is looking at Miro from their own device, there will still be someone to look at that feature that you want to discuss. And then what also I found helpful was having the lead facilitator in the plenary, but also facilitators in the breakout rooms to be able to guide the process, so that when you're doing a collective thing, you're looking at the same screen or you're looking at the shared screen. And then when you have to collaborate remotely on Miro, you are all summoned to a particular part of the screen that is able to help you collaborate on the workshop.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. There was, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, but there was one last question that came in I thought was interesting, and we actually had this case with NetHope, our Africa Regional Chapter meeting recently. The question is, how about cases of groups compromising people who speak different languages? How have you handled this in the past for greater participation and impact?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to that same kind of prep idea and thinking about your roster. Another thing to document if it is an international kind of wide scale workshop is to maybe add in a column, to be honest, around languages, who's comfortable in English, or can some of the sessions be run localized? Because I think it's really important to also remember that sometimes like just having native language in the workshop provides just better outputs, period. You know, so is there an opportunity to actually have localized mini workshops that are maybe boiling up to a larger workshop where those insights can be extracted? I think that's a very, very good question. And I've definitely seen benefits of doing workshops in native languages. Which is actually a better trade-off, you know, compared to trying to get everyone doing it in a language that may not be their first language. So really good point.
It may not be a perfect solution, but one of the things that happened in the Africa chapter meeting for NetHope was that the upfront presentation was real-time translated with subtitles into 3 languages people could choose. And then breakout sessions were created for people in their native languages, and in some cases that might work. I didn't attend, but it apparently worked very, very well with our recent conference.
Oh, good to know.
So we are getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to pass it back to Ritika, who wants to do a last little Menti exercise.
Great.
So please look at your screens.
Thank you. Yep, this is just a one question Menti, just so we can understand sort of some of the themes that resonated with you all the most. So if you could just, if possible, go back to menti.com and use the code 787274. It'll also be up on this screen in one moment. We just want to understand a little bit more around the topics that resonated with you or that you would take away the most around for future virtual meetings and workshops. Was it around engagement? Was it around sort of your backup plans? It sounds like creating the right structure and the preparation really stood out. Some pieces around remote working tools, but it sounds like a lot of people already knew that. Ways to co-create remotely, great. Okay, so it sounds like the preparation, keeping everyone engaged, and sort of the backup plans were some of the major key themes and areas of takeaway that stood out to folks. So that's really great to hear. And again, thank you for your feedback, and feel free to pop anything else in the chat window. We'll be looking out for any comments that folks have as well. Thank you.
We'll turn it back to you, Madeline.
Thank you, Frederick, and thank you to all of our speakers today. It was a great presentation, so much to learn, and lots of great attendee interaction as well. Great questions today. Thank you for attending today's session. We would ask you again to please complete our webinar satisfaction poll to get your feedback on what you thought about today's session. A link is in the chat window, and a new window should pop up as you close out of the Zoom session. Don't forget to look for that email with the links to the recording and the deck for the session today and other information. And we hope that you will attend another session in the future, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.